Welcome to another episode of Rose Resource Room. Today, I have a special guest with me who will be speaking at the Midwinter Conference, Mr. Ethan Demme. Welcome.
Welcome. Thanks for having me, Ro.
It is my pleasure. And can you give us a brief intro and just share a little bit about who you are?
Sure. So my name's Ethan Demme. If you're in the homeschool space, you probably are familiar with Demme Learning or Matthew C. If you've used any Matthew C products, you've seen a guy on the videos who's bald. So that's my dad. So I've been in the homeschool world my entire life in one way or another. So I currently am the CEO of Demme Learning. That's my day job. And then I've got multiple other hats that I wear. So my formal hats are I'm a elected township official in East Lampeter Township. So I'm finishing up my second 6-year term. So this is my 12th year in office. And so I've been involved in politics a lot. I'm also on the board of the Parental Rights Foundation, which is a national nonprofit advocating for parental rights at the state and federal level. But for fun, I enjoy going outside, very outdoorsy. My wife and I enjoy hiking. That's how we got to know each other was taking long walks at college and going on runs. And we've been walking and running ever since. I'm also a adoptive dad of four. So my wife and I were foster parents, and then we adopted four beautiful kiddos. We just hit the 4-year anniversary mark of them getting placed with us. So
Oh,
it's been
congratulations.
fun. That's a whole nother journey, another talk for another time, but that's sort of what else I do. And then you can see behind me, I have a little workshop. This was a little one-car garage, so I like to build things. So most of my
Mm.
meetings in my life is spent around sitting in meetings, sending emails, talking about plans, and I find it beneficial to do things with my hands and see accomplishments. So I do woodworking. I dabble in all sorts of things. I just learned to blacksmith this last year.
Oh, wow.
Welding. I build bikes and batteries. I've got 3D printers back there. So I like to tinker and make things. Is sort of my way to keep sane when I've been sitting in meetings nonstop for hours.
Very, very nice. I love it. So how long have you been CEO of Demi Learning?
So I've been CEO since 2011. So it's 14 years now. And then before that, I ran sort of operations for a few years. And before that, I was the marketing director. So I
Okay, so you were in the
started,
company the whole
you know,
your entire career.
yep.
Very, very nice. So much to unpack. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the political piece. In Pennsylvania, there's high regulation, and then I actually live in New Jersey where there's low regulation. Don't tell anybody we're under the radar. So I would love to hear from you. What do you think that parents, individuals, and collectively, so whether you're just a family or you're a co-op or a community, how do you think that parents should engage in these kind of political things? Because I feel like some people think if it's not their job, then it's not their job, right? And we know that to be different. So, like, what are some practical ways for parents to get involved in politics, specifically as it relates to the homeschool world?
Yeah, so those are two sort of different things, and they take slightly different approaches, and it all depends on sort of what your family calling is. So I'm a
Mm,
big proponent of figuring out what's unique about your family. What are you as a group or your tribe? What are you interested in doing? And some folks are very interested in sort of the legislative process and going
hmm
to, rallies at Harrisburg or rallies in DC and sort of in that advocacy role. Some families don't want to do that at all. Some families are very involved. Like my kids like to go to the parks. So we're a little more involved sort of at a family level. We've got a local fire company that we support, and we helped do a fundraiser for a few years ago.
Mm.
And so it was something like we go to the parks, we like to run. So we helped host a 0.5K fundraiser. So
Uh,
0.5K is the 5K for the rest of us. Um, and it was a fun one. We had a nap station, we had a donut station, we had a meat station. But the process of hosting a fundraiser at a community park, I involved my kids in that. So something they've been to the park, so they drew a map of what we're doing and they colored
mm,
it. Then they came with me to the parks board meeting. And we presented to the Parks Board what we're doing, and then they gave us approval to use the park. And then we met with the fire company and some of their volunteers and worked with them. So in that way, our kids, the goal was, how do I get my kids understanding how politics works? It's not
Yeah.
what's on TV. It's not what's on Twitter. It's not on Facebook. It's your neighbors are on the Parks Board and they're volunteering their time to sit in a meeting that's usually boring. Um, and if your family's interested, you can go, and they go, how does, so it was a great opportunity to talk to my kids about, all right, well, there's a Parks Board. Here's what
Mm.
they oversee as far as parks. What suggestions do you have? And so then they could then attend a meeting, talk to the people at the meeting who were super happy to just have anyone show up to a parks and recreation meeting.
Okay.
Um, and they could see that process work. There was a vote to adopt our proposal to let us use the park, and then we
Yeah.
could use the park. So they could see that sort of little process of, here's how government really works at the
Hmm.
local level. It's a formal way of talking with your neighbors about what you want to do to help your neighbors.
And that is so practical and so hands-on. And then it reminds me of the good old Tip O'Neill that all politics is local, right? We think if you're
100%.
not voting for the president, then you're not doing anything. I'm like, no, no, no. Your roads, the infrastructure, these things, they're all local. So I love that your children were able to watch the entire process and understand so intimately that this decision, this event that's happening right here, we have the whole backstory and we were a part of it. That's really awesome.
Yeah, so that's sort of one of the talks I'm doing. And it's, if anyone, sits down with me at lunch for 5 minutes, you'll hear me talking about zoning and local government.
Hmm.
So it's something I'm very passionate about. I've been involved in national politics, national campaigns, state wide campaigns. I've run for office. I've run campaigns. I've led political parties. I've started political parties. So but I got involved the same way that most people, or I hope my kids do, which is in 1996, I was 14, and my dad was interested in a local congressional race and started volunteering, and I went and worked the polls. So I stood outside a
Mm.
polling place in East Drumore Township where a couple hundred people vote in, surrounded by trees in Amish farms in southern Lancaster County, and I handed out brochures of, here's who we think you should vote for.
Yeah.
And that process of, it is local, but it took my dad being interested in something and then involving the family in the process. So that's what I hope
Mm.
to do is, what are my kids interested in? What do we do as a family? How can we take that interest and show up and help our neighbors in some way? So the encouraging part is basically find out what you're interested in and then show up. And a lot of time there is a difficulty in engaging in local government. So there's a barrier of
Hmm.
entry, if you will. So usually people show up who are angry. So
Hmm.
go to a school board meeting, 90% of the time, no one's there, no one cares. And that, 1 or 2% of the time, you get 100 screaming parents and they're yelling at each other and yelling at the school board.
Yeah,
And it's a place you frankly don't want to take your kids.
that's true. Right.
But it should be a place that you
Right.
take your kids. So the question is, so my encouragement is, how do we start getting involved before everyone gets angry?
Proactively. Yeah. Hmm.
And if you are sort of a sane person and you show up and you ask a few questions, you will quickly get asked to volunteer for a board or a commission or a study group,
Mm.
because every local government and every local civic organization, it's like those are also forms of government. I'm a big
Hmm.
fan of Alec, de Tocqueville, who talks about the little platoons in American society, and that's what made America great, was the fact that we had civic institutions, we had churches, we had volunteer fire companies. All of
Hmm.
these local small organizations are the buffer between the individual and the large government. Uh,
Right.
and that's also where we learn. If you've been a member of a church and been on a decorating committee and wrangling, 10 people on a decorating committee on what's the best type of carpet we should put in the sanctuary, that's where you learn how to negotiate, run a meeting, make sure
Right.
everyone's heard, but then make a decision that not everyone will like, and then move on from that. And we've lost those mediating institutions. We've lost that muscle memory of how to sit down with your neighbor and talk about something make a decision, compromise, vote on it, and then move on from there without splitting into two churches or
Oh,
starting a
I
new
know.
denomination or starting your own fire company. So it's how do we resolve that conflict in small rooms? We've lost the practice of that. So the more families can get involved at the local level with small, boring meetings, which the decisions affect those families every single day, that's where you can start to build the muscle of here's how you can actually navigate government. And if you
Mm.
learn there, you can take it to Harrisburg a lot better.
That's really, really good. So a couple of things stood out for me. The first was the idea of servanthood. What you're teaching your children and how you're allowing them to show up, you're teaching them to have that servant's heart. And it's such a great leadership tool, if you will. The second thing is when you talked about the proactive solution versus you showing up when it's kind of too late or when the decision has already been made, was when you're proactive, you get to be a part of the solution. Your voice gets to be heard that way. Because honestly, when you're screaming, no one is hearing you anyways. So the passion is actually not being used in the most positive way. And the last part that I heard was when you talked about how we lost that skill and we lost that connection. And it makes me think of cancel culture. It's like, what? Ethan said what? Oh, no, I don't like that. He's canceled. Why can't I just come to you and say, you said this XYZ. Can you share more about how you got to that thought? Can you share your perspective so I can actually understand someone else's thought versus the ridiculous thing, and I can't believe I'm going to go on record saying this, of my truth. There is no your truth. There is the truth, and everything else is your opinion and your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
It really is an interesting one because I mean I've been in politics long enough that I've not everyone likes every decision I've made. We'll put it that way. But I've had people try to cancel me,
Mm,
and they've but from both sides. So I've had some extremist right folks who are trying to cancel me because I'm friends with or talked with someone who that they disagree with
right.
or appeared on their TV show or podcast. And I've
Mm,
had the far left try to cancel me because I'm friends with people on the right and I go on their podcasts and talk to them. And it's one of I've always had the ability, and I think part of it is how I was raised to really be able to see both sides.
right.
I've got a very strong belief system of what I believe, and I don't really hide it very, very well. But it's one of I try to do it in a way where I'm trying to understand the other person
Right.
and what their perspective is.
Yeah,
Because
not polarizing.
a lot of times in government, it really is people have a very common objective most of the time. The question is now, how do we do it? The implementation
Mm,
of that objective and with what means.
right.
I've got a current issue I'm working on in my township of that has to do with zoning, a couple of them. And it's one where a lot of it is we've lost the basic civics of understanding the separation of powers.
Mm,
So we've got a legislative branch, we've got a judicial branch, and we've got an executive branch. And we have that literally from the township borough level all the way to the federal government. And people will hear about something and go to a meeting and it's like, and they'll yell at that meeting. And I go, but that person can't make that decision. Like they're acting in a
that's not me.
judicial way. They should be interpreting the law, not making the law.
Right.
Legislative body, no one shows up to the meeting.
Mm,
Um, and so understand, and I find that most people don't understand how that works at the federal level, the state level, and more importantly, the county and local level, where that separation of powers, the way our country and our states and our boroughs and our commonwealths were set up, there was a reason we set it up that way.
mm.
And we've forgotten that. We're too concerned with what's the outcome that I want rather
Yeah,
than the
the
process to get
process.
there is supposed to be slow so that government can't do things quickly.
Right.
That's the
And
point.
I hope you're right when you say that we forgot it. I'm wondering if a lot of people just never learned it. Because you think of so many institutions that are no longer teaching civics or government, or families are not having the conversation at the dinner table anymore. And I'm like, did you ever know that this was how it was supposed to work? I really hope we just forgot.
Yeah, I think there's a generation that was never taught it to begin with, and a lot of that came from we got so busy. So if I were to rant on some of the problems with culture, that I'm grateful that I didn't grow up with some of those so I could see them a little bit. So my parents prioritized family time over busy time.
Oh, I love
So
that.
we didn't do lots of sports. So we did some sports with our homeschool co-ops, but we weren't part of traveling baseball teams. So the
Hmm.
amount I see parents either from the previous generation or the current generation where every night they're driving their kids to a different event. I mean, I know homeschool parents that are busier than public school
Oh
parents
yeah.
driving their kids to activities. They're the Uber, and there's no time to do any. You can't take a breath,
Yeah.
and you don't have time to volunteer for a volunteer fire company or help with a potluck at church because, oh, I've got traveling softball, I've got lacrosse, I've got dance practice, I've got you name it. We've become so busy with our lives that we can't take a break and calm down. So a lot of it is basically saying, and because we have cars and we're busy and we've got the media, we are always feeling like we're missing out on something. So we're driving to this, but it also makes it really easy to switch. So if I don't like that little league team,
Hmm.
I can switch to the one across town. If I
Hmm.
don't like that calisthenics coach, I can go to the other one. If I don't like this church, I can go to the other church down the street. So we become a consumer culture where we
Mm.
can pick and choose what news we listen to, who our neighbors are, who we want to hang out with, who our kids' friends are, and we choose it and we make our own little bubble. And that bubble is just people that we agree with. And the beauty of sort of, in my mind, going back to who is your neighbor is literally like walk next door
Yeah.
and walk the next door. I was talking with a friend the other day in a group, and he was talking about how he and his family had like a Thanksgiving meal with their block.
Oh, nice.
And everyone else went, I've never heard of someone doing that. Like,
Yeah.
when's the last time you invited your neighbors on your street over for dinner?
Hmm.
And it's one
Or
I
do you
was
even know your neighbor's name?
yeah, it was I before kids, I used to travel a lot. So I spoke at homeschool conferences around the country. I was working, going to education conferences, and I was on the road 20, 25 weekends a year, which
Wow.
is not healthy, not sustainable. Um, and at the time, I felt convicted because I was like, I have much more in common with the jet setter businessman sitting next to me at an airport, or sitting next to me at a dinner, at a conference, or meeting with other people. I feel more in common with them than I actually do my neighbor, and I don't even know my neighbor's name. My wife
Hmm.
is very good at this. She's good at talking with our neighbors. And so as I've slowed down having kids, I've recognized there's a benefit to being able to walk down the street, talk to someone face to face. And you can solve a lot of problems when you actually skip the email, skip the phone call, and actually have a face to face conversation. You get to know people a lot better.
Absolutely. And then you have that connection, and we're not operating in isolation. You touched on family time versus busy time. And I can admit that as a homeschool parent, I was overscheduled. And in the moment, it felt good. It felt fun. I was raising well-rounded children. And, we're doing all the things. And I remember saying to my boys, guys, you're in guitar, you're in piano, you have Mandarin, you have Latin, you have this, you have that. We have co-op on Monday weekly, and then we have a bi-weekly one on Friday. I think we're doing too much. And, we talked about it. We said, slowing down does not mean boring. It doesn't mean that we sit at home and do nothing all day, but it means that we have time for more spontaneous things. It means that we have time for more meaningful things. And, we had the conversation, which I'm really proud of myself because normally I just make decisions. Like, this is what we're doing, guys. But I had the conversation with them, and I just taught them as I was learning the joy of missing out. Because I think a lot of the times it's the fear of all the homeschool myths, you're trying to dispel them in your family. Or all the things that people say about homeschoolers or this, you're like, well, not in my family. I'm going to make sure they know everything so no one can say this about my family.
Mhm.
And when I say it out loud, I would be like, oh, forget that. I'm not going to succumb to that pressure. But it's that subconscious or unconscious thought that creates an anxiety like, oh my gosh, if my son doesn't know every sport, what's going to happen? If my son doesn't do this, and I'm like, I pull my kids out to let them stand out, for them not to be able to blend in. I don't care about socialization. I don't care about all of that. But why is my lifestyle showing the complete opposite? Right. So
Yep.
when he talks about you Ubering, like that was me. I'm like, okay, here I am. And we did have good conversations in the car. We did listen to great audiobooks and have really Socratic discussions and all the things, but we were tired. And this year, I'm like, forget FOMO, we're doing JOMO. It's a joy of missing out, and we are happy. Because you talked about how you can just kind of switch from things to things and the paradox of choice. And we don't teach them the character of the stick to itness, right? That faithfulness, that consistency. It's, oh, you don't like that? For me, I always said to my kids, if you don't like something, that's fine, but you're going to stick out the entire season. We are not about
Right.
to switch, right? But it really is a consumer culture. And I never thought of that terminology until you said it. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I love that you also uh, just talk with your kids about here's what I'm thinking and we can make changes. That's been a struggle for me of my wife will sometimes tell me, you need to turn off the CEO mode. Um, and so learning with my kids is how we do it together. So we can say, hey, are we doing too much stuff? So I love that you're modeling that to your kids and just saying, here's what we're doing. What do you think? And letting them get some agency because you're teaching them how to think by thinking out loud.
That's right. And I will say it's not natural. It's something I've had to be very intentional about. Culturally, I'm the mom. I make the decisions, right? Like my husband and I make the decisions. That's just it. Um, but I've had to unlearn certain things and say, okay, as a Jamaican woman, this might be how we do it. As a Nigerian husband, that's how my husband does things, but what does the word of God say? Or if I'm really teaching critical thinking, how do they practice that if I'm telling them what to do and what to think, right? So I
Yep.
really had to unlearn certain cultural things, stick to the ones that were really good, but the ones that didn't serve us so well, I had to be able to let go of those. One thing you mentioned way back in your intro was you like to build things, you like to tinker. And then you talked about you recently learning blacksmithing. And I'm wondering if that love of learning came from the fact that you're homeschooling, or if you ever made the connection between the Matthew C pieces and the tinkering with this, or if it's completely just random.
No, I would definitely credit sort of so I was homeschooled all the way through. My parents homeschooled me and my brothers. And that I the ability to there was things we had to learn. So
Hmm.
we had our math, we had our regular schedule of things, but then sort of after we did the basics, it was what are you passionate about?
Mm,
And being able to tinker and tinkering requires time.
yeah.
It requires the brain to get bored, and then you can start to make things. So making forts in the woods, building things with wood. And we didn't build awesome, amazing things. Our family was not the cover of the homeschool magazine where we all, raised our own sheep and then played the cello and then knit our own clothing. Um, we played the recorders and we could burp the alphabet. That was sort of our family's speed. But we had a lot of fun
Hmm.
tinkering with stuff. I mean, we would go to yard sales a lot, mainly because uh, my older brother believed that whenever we prayed for something like we didn't have enough money, that God always answered prayer through yard sales. Uh, because we couldn't buy new clothes.
Yeah.
So yard sales, my mom would be buying clothes and I would find the old stereo that was for free or for like 25 cents. So I would get all the
Hmm.
old electronic stuff that was just busted and didn't work. And then I would take it apart. So
Mm,
started with a hammer and then and I didn't have people to teach me how to do it or a YouTube video to show me. So I just sort of
right.
figured it out. I didn't fix anything. I wasn't able to put it back together. Now I'm able to do that more, but I could take out, little motors and then hook them up to batteries and then, so we were always tinkering and making things. And yeah, the having the time to be bored is what allows you to be creative. You can't be
Yes.
creative without being bored.
Right. Which is why I'm so anti my kids spending hours on a screen or just like pressing their fingers doing video games. They know, like there's certain words they can't use. So they've become more creative. Like they can't say to me they're bored because I'll say, "Oh, you can clean the windows, you can clean like we have things to do, right?" So they become more creative like, "Oh, mom, what can I do right now?" So I'm like, find one of your interests. If you want to draw, do Legos, whatever it is, go and do this. And now they just don't ask me because they know. But you're so right. We don't have time to sit and think. We don't make the time. We haven't prioritized it. So I've been trying to be intentional about that.
Yeah, and it's one of so the other thing that we've learned or I've learned through my kids is sort of the ability to play outside and have little micro adventures and build risk. So it's one of so you need to be bored to be creative.
Yeah,
And then how do you build risk assessment with your kids? Because the end goal is really you want your kids to be able to be independent
that's right.
and think critically and make stuff and follow their passion. But how do you teach that? And uh, having kids who came from foster care and then you adopted, there's a lot more fear and uncertainty. And so the
Yeah.
ability to teach risk is a little harder, but it also
Mm,
requires, it's similar to how do you teach creativity? So it's one of you can't really teach someone to be creative and you can't teach someone to take a risk. What you can
model
do
it.
is you can create an environment where they feel comfortable being creative or taking a risk. And a lot of that is building that sort of sense of I'm safe. And it's an irony of you can't learn how to do proper risk assessment and let from a position of fear. You have to come from a position of safety. Um, so if your kid's climbing on the monkey bars, standing on top, if they've never been safe doing similar things or they don't feel safe, then they will make very bad decisions. They're going to get hurt.
Yeah.
Uh, but if you teach them how to feel safe, and then it's we have the motto at our house of once we have that safety, it's all right, climb as high as you feel safe. So we don't have any rules about how high you can climb. It's how high can you climb where you feel safe and where you can get down because I will not help you down.
I love that. And then you're teaching consequences, right? Well, this is what
Yep.
happens when you do this versus dad saving them each time. They're not learning the lesson. The lesson
And
is call
different
my
kids
dad.
can climb higher. So I have one son who is much more
Spider-Man.
like me, who is climbing everything, but he's also very capable of doing that.
Hmm.
Uh, he's not capable of handling a knife. His sibling is can handle a knife all day safely. Does not climb nearly as high. So it's about they can, but allows us to differentiate and say, well, why can't I do what my brother does? Well, he's demonstrated that he can do that safely,
Right. Right.
and you have the opportunity to do that. And so it's a my mindset's been shifted through becoming a parent of it's less about direct instruction and more about creating an environment where they can experiment and as they feel comfortable and safe start to experiment more and do more and more dangerous things.
Mm, that's really, really good. So you're sharing a lot about the dad dynamic. What about on the other side of the generation with your dad? Like, what has that looked like in terms of communication or managing conflicts? How have you been able to navigate that personally and also professionally?
Yeah, there's so it's not just my dad, but my parents and my brother. So the whole family has been involved in Demi Learning as we've grown. So our family-owned business started in our basement. So in the early days, it was just child labor, and you did what you were told. And then after college is when I came in and said, all right, I've got this skill set of background in marketing and communications. I'd love to add value and you can teach me those other things. So it's been a process of shifting from he's the boss to I'm a peer to I'm the boss.
Mm,
And it's one of family businesses are fantastic because you get to see your family every day. And family businesses are very difficult and hard sometimes because you
because
get
you
to
get
see
to
your
see your
family.
family every day.
The pros and cons of family business are pretty much the same as homeschooling. You, you get to see your family every day, and then the con is you get to see your kids all stinking day. Um, so it has been a process, and I think it's been an interesting one. We had a consultant when we started to transition me into this role and also transition ownership between generations. And so we said we hired a family business consultant, which is a fancy word for we paid someone to be the family counselor uh,
Right.
for a few years because those meetings are uh, because you're learning how to both interact on what's the best business decision to make here with the person that stole your Legos when you were a kid. Because when your siblings are involved, so you have things will trigger you, and you're like, why am if this was another owner or another manager, it wouldn't we could just talk through it, but it's my
Right.
sibling, and like, oh, I've got 42 years of baggage with you.
That's so
Um,
funny.
and sometimes you have to stop. And so one thing that we found very helpful is we call it hats.
Okay.
So it's one of uh so talking to my dad or my brothers or my mom, it's I've got the business hat on as like the ownership. I've got the owner hat on, I've got the shareholder hat on, I've got the CEO hat on,
Yeah.
or I've got the son hat on.
Mm,
And so it allows us to pivot in the conversation. All right, we're going to stop talking about the business now. Now we're going to shift over to I'm your brother, I'm your son,
that's right.
and we're going to talk this way because the objective of that we sort of worked through was the end goal is we want to be able to always have Thanksgiving dinner and be able to talk to each other.
I love
Uh,
that.
so that's the one. So if the business gets to the point where we can't do that, then it's fine if one of us leaves the business, but we're not leaving the family. So the family
Mm,
is there. We're committed to working through that, but you don't have to work here. And so it allows us to separate those two. And that's been one. And there's been times when my mom's had to ban, all right, no more business talk at the family gathering.
oh,
And
wow.
my dad and I will sneak out for a walk sometimes and still catch up. But there's been it's been a process, but learning to make sure that we're committed to this process and communicating even when things get rough.
Yeah.
Learning how to say, I'm going to take a break and leave the room for a couple days maybe, and then we'll come back and work through it is the main thing. So as long as you're committed to the relationship, you can work through it and then sort of separate the business world from the family world, even though realistically they never actually get separated.
Yeah, that's the Bible in action from the 70 times 70, how many times I have to forgive to the Matthew, okay, how do we go through this kind of conflict? Like everything, you're modeling it, you're living it out, and you're practicing it daily. So good for you. So, Ethan, I've asked you 205 questions. What are your like final thoughts in terms of what would you want to share with any homeschool family? What are you even going to cover at the Midwinter Conference? Can you give us a sneak peek and then share your final thoughts?
Yeah, so I've got three. They asked me to do three talks, which I've done different. One's a new one-ish. I've done it only twice, and that's what I'm probably most excited about. So I'm talking about parental rights in Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
So that'll be covering that's more the legal piece. That's the state focus. I've got one on sort of showing up, show up politics, getting and teaching civics to your kids through virtues. That's more focused on that local level we talked about at the
Yeah.
beginning. And then the last one is a new one, which is sort of how to adventure with your kids. That's what we talked about. How do we build that risk muscle? Uh,
Hmm.
and how do we have the micro adventures? You don't always have to have a big fancy thing. So,
That's
and
right.
it's been fun with my kids because they came sort of not experiencing the outdoors a whole lot.
Hmm.
I remember even in the first probably 2 months of them living with us. It was really interesting. So I have we've had a couple sets of foster kids. So I've now done this a few times of how do I get them comfortable with going outside, and we like to camp and hike. Um, and so we watch YouTube videos. There's a great channel, Outdoor Boys, where a dad takes his kids camping a lot. So we watch some videos. They get used to the idea. Um, and so we start out with a tent in our basement.
Okay.
So we just make room in the family room. I've got a little fireplace there. We literally pitch a tent inside and we sleep out. We cook s'mores on the fireplace, and it gets them the idea of, oh, this is what a tent is. And then we move out to the yard and we'll sleep in the tent in the yard. So before we ever go on a camping trip, they've been in that tent, they've set it up. It's been in our yard, it's been in the house. They're comfortable with it.
Hmm.
Uh, and it was funny though with my kids. This was 4 years ago in February. They'd only been living with us officially for about a month, and we were watching these outdoor videos, and they said, we want to go camping in the snow too. I was
Oh,
like,
you do.
sure. And my wife's looking at me like, are you nuts? And I'm like, they're not gonna do it. So we spent the day. I bought a tarp from Tractor Supply, and I built a fire. I pulled out a bunch of sleeping bags and yoga mats, and we made some padding. And I was like, all right. And we had a little tarp set up and a fire. And I was like, look, if you get cold or scared, the house is right down. We're just up the hill. We're in a little forest on our property. And I was like, we can go inside. And the youngest was too young, so I had three older ones. And by older, they were 6 and 7. Like they were little kids. And I was like, and it was like 20 degrees outside, and there was snow on the ground. So we're outside, not even a tent, just a lean-to. And I was like, they're not going to last long. They slept the whole night. They still talk about that. It was one of their most fun adventures.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was a tarp. It was a $10 tarp from Tractor Supply, a stack of wood and a bunch of blankets. We didn't get a lot of sleep, but we had fun. And those are the micro adventures
Yeah,
that when I tell other parents that, they go, "Oh, I'd love to do that." And it's like, you can just do it.
right.
You don't have to do this big thing where
Yeah,
we go, and I do bigger things. I take the kids, we go camping, we go rock climbing, we
nice.
do racing, we go on canoeing trips, we go snowshoeing. Like we do some actual adventurous things now that they're older, that I know plenty of adults wouldn't do those things. But it's simple things so the goal is, how do you just start with little things around your house in your neighborhood that are adventures to your kids? And the goal of those adventures is push them outside their comfort zone just a little bit, not completely. Do it with them, and learn how to explore the world and try new things. And you can see their minds just open up when you do these fun little experiences. Um, Simple things like, we go on hikes every day, but sometimes I go on the hike, and I had my two boys one time because my wife had two in therapy, and we were on a walk, and they were like, "Well, what's that little trail go to?" And it was a deer trail. And I'm like, we had nothing scheduled for the next 2 hours. So we just
Let's go find out.
explored
Yeah.
in the middle of and it was in the park in Lancaster County. Like, we're not in the middle of the wilderness, but to
Hmm.
them, they were off the trail. They couldn't see the road. It was this really cool, fun thing. And I had to carry them over some streams. They got hit by nettles, and like, those are where their brains got expanded to the next level. And so that's the goal of that talk, is to really share that you can go on little adventures, and those adventures will keep getting bigger, and you get really close in connection when you do that with your kids, which is the main objective for me, is to build that deep attachment, because the kids have to rely on you for their actual safety, for their food.
Absolutely.
And it's this deep psychological connection you make. And then also seeing them blossom once they do it, and then start to challenge you and go, I want to do even more. And now after 4 years, now I'm trying to keep up with them rather than me trying to get them to keep up with me.
That's where I am right now. My boys are like, let's go deeper. And I'm like, I can't see the car anymore. Let's go. Awesome. All right. So what are your final thoughts? Whether it's like something you've learned, something you wish you knew as you were on your journey, anything. Like what would you like to tell the listeners?
Final thoughts is, I would say I learned it from my parents, and then I'm relearning it again with my kids, which is, it's a process. And
Mm,
you have to be like, homeschooling is more than just an education choice. It's a lifestyle. Even when I wasn't homeschooling my kids, everyone would ask us if we were homeschoolers because we had the vibe. So the
ah,
vibe of homeschooling is really, we're willing to wing it. We're willing to learn something new with our kids. We're willing to try
mm,
something that we're not sure about, see if it works. And so that ability to try something new, learn with your kids, figure out if you want to do it again or not, and then that process, that modeling, is that's the lifelong learning that
mm,
you're really embracing when you start to go into that homeschooling world. The cultural vibe is, we're just winging it. Like, we're not
mm.
following a plan. We're figuring out, what are we doing this week? We've got the schedule, but each year it's, well, what's the best thing for our family this year? Just because we did something last year doesn't mean we have to keep doing
That's
it.
right.
Um, so that constant learning and evolution and figuring out what works and what doesn't, that's that's the joy of it, and the scary part, and the part that makes it worth it.
It totally is a paradox. And you really nail it. So you heard it here first. Homeschooling is a vibe. It's a lifestyle. I really love that. Thank you so, so much for your time today. If you have tons of questions, you need to come to the Midwinter Conference and sit in these sessions so that you can ask them directly to Mr. Ethan Demme. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.